Thank you, everybody. Lovely to see such a full house. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. I've always admired the German Lutheran pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but I've hesitated to speak about him because of his theistic paradigm. Being a non-theist, being a humanist, I worry that not talking about theism and God, I'll misrepresent him. So I'm going to do that today. I warn you, I'm going to use the term God a lot, because I don't think you can understand him without that. He said that all other issues are secondary. He said, in fact, the question of good and evil come after the question of God. Now, for me, as an ethical culture leader, I begin with questions like, how do I be good? How do I do good? But Bonhoeffer said that the real question is, what is the will of God? Now, he warns that quite often we begin with human morality as humanists, and when we do that, we actually violate what he believes is necessary. He says, man's origin is God, but when thinking of good and evil, he conceives of himself as the origin of good and evil, and thus is separated from God. But I can speak about Bonhoeffer more confidently by talking about things that he shared with the founder of ethical culture, Felix Adler. They were both born in Germany to relatively well-to-do families. As children, they both experienced the horrors of war, though from a distance. Bonhoeffer's older brother, Walter, died in World War I 2 weeks after enlisting in the German army. For Adler, he lived as an adolescent in New York City through the Civil War. They both thought that military conflict was an abomination, though each of them wrestled with the fact that sometimes it seemed like violence was necessary. Both sought to model a new way of living that rejected materialism and embraced ethics. Both wanted to nurture the idea of the unity of humanity. Both defended reason. Both opened themselves up to the suffering of the world. Both valued deed more than creed. And both were willing to defend the oppressed against corrupt authority. Something we need a lot more of today in this world. Now, since Bonhoeffer's not known by everybody, I want to give a brief biography to give some context. He and his twin sister were born in Breslau, Germany in 1906. They and their 5 older siblings were raised by Karl, a psychiatrist, and their mother, Paula, a teacher. Dietrich was well educated. He learned to play the piano. And then at 14, to the shock of his rather secular family, he decided to study theology. In 1924, he entered the seminary in Berlin, where his mentor was the theologian Karl Barth. At 22 years old, he graduated summa cum laude with a doctorate. He then went to New York and studied at Union Theological. Returning to Germany in the early 30s, he resisted Nazism from the start. In 1933, Hitler orchestrated the takeover of the German evangelical church by the anti-Semitic German Christian movement. And in response, Bonhoeffer and others wrote the Barmen Declaration, proclaiming that Christ, not the Führer, was the head of the church. Soon, the confessing church, as it was known, became a tool of resistance. After 2 years of ministering to German evangelical churches in London, he went back to Germany and began to work in an underground seminary, training pastors for the confessing church. The Nazis denounced him as a pacifist and an enemy of the state, and the Gestapo began to arrest pastors and students of the seminary. So Bonhoeffer and others began to go from village to village as part of what became known as a seminary on the run. I love that image. He went back to New York again briefly in 1939, but he worried that he could not participate in the rebuilding of Germany after the eventual defeat of the Nazis if he did not suffer with his flock. That's when those opposing Hitler within the German government actually got him hired by the Abwehr, the German intelligence service. They said that Bonhoeffer's wide ecumenical contacts in England and the United States would be useful to them. But Bonhoeffer used that cover to be a courier for the resistance. He was arrested on April 5th, 1943. After the Nazis found that the head of the Abwehr, Admiral Canaris, was involved in assassination plots against Hitler, Hitler ordered widespread executions. And just a couple of weeks before the liberation of the camp Flossenburg, he was hung April 9th, 1945. So today I want to try to honor him by talking about what I saw him sharing with Adler that I respect. We'll start with how Adler and Bonhoeffer sought to build unity both in their lives and in the world. They brought together people of diverse religious perspectives in order to find common ground. For a few years, Adler was head of the Free Religious Association, which was a group of liberal religious thinkers seeking inclusive global religious fellowship. Bonhoeffer studied under Karl Barth, the leading theologian of the time, who condemned the tribalism that was fracturing the Christian church and creating competing sects. And in fact, Bonhoeffer's thesis, which was titled The Communion of Saints, is a reflection of that focus on unity. Bonhoeffer became a rising star in the ecumenical movement, which fostered global dialogue and cooperation. But on a more profound theological level regarding unity, Dietrich challenged Luther's doctrine of two kingdoms that said that church leaders and secular authorities had separate spheres. Bonhoeffer insisted that God and the secular world were intimately intertwined, that he believed that God was very much in this world. Now that played into Bonhoeffer's rejection of monasticism, the trend for clergy to retreat from the world into cloistered monasteries. He said that was an abdication of their duties. He said, quote, "The man who would leave the earth, who would depart from the present distress, loses the power which still holds him by eternal mysterious forces. The earth remains our mother, just as God remains our father." So he's tying those together. True Christians, Bonhoeffer said, should embrace, not abandon, the everyday world. Bonhoeffer saw human community, whether it was a single congregation or a nation or all of humanity, as a manifestation of Christ. He spoke of, quote, Christ existing as community. Disturbed by the growing conflict in Germany and the rest of the world, he asked, when the community is split, is Christ himself divided? He answered, yes. To heal Christ, he said, you have to heal communities. That reflects a lot of our ethical culture tradition without the God talk, which emphasizes the importance of compassionate, ethical, and whole communities, people that stick together. Adler had a theory called the ethical manifold, which was an interconnected web of human relationships between mutually affirming individuals. And that fits well into Bonhoeffer's perspective. Both men believed that relationships do not subsume the individual. Relationships actually made us more individual, made us unique nodes on that interconnected web. In his book, Ethics, Bonhoeffer writes about balancing individualism by understanding that each person is a part of a nexus, was the term he used. This nexus doesn't negate individualism. According to Renat Wind, the author of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, A Spoke in the Wheel, Bonhoeffer believed that the Germans celebrated, quote, the truly free man who willingly subordinates himself to the whole. Now, obviously, that can be manipulated to support very destructive collectivist states like fascism. But it was a dynamic of both Bonhoeffer and Adler to create goodness. Another similarity between the two men is that they both embraced suffering. For Bonhoeffer, that's not a surprise given Lutheranism's emphasis on the crucifixion. But Adler also emphasized suffering, particularly in his analysis of spiritual pain. But in this case, in Adler's case, the pain is not of Christ on the cross, but of all of us, because we have our eyes open and our hearts open. Adler writes that the pain we feel is, quote, due to the fate of the innumerable fellow beings who perish by the wayside, to those many thousands who are dying unhelped in hospitals. We stand, as it were, on the shore and see multitudes of our fellow beings struggling in the water, stretching forth their arms, sinking, drowning, and we are powerless to assist them. These profound limitations for Adler breaks his heart, and it breaks our hearts. He explained, the reason is that we think of the pain, we do not think beyond the pain. Now, the solution, thus, is to look beyond the pain and focus on transforming it. Near the end of the book, An Ethical Philosophy of Life, Adler references Arnold Winklerud, a legendary hero whose sacrifice helped the Swiss defeat the Austrian army in the Battle of Sempat in 1386. In this legend, Winklerud gathers the spears of the Austrian army into his chest. Adler, who suffered a lot of frustrations trying to build a more ethical world, said that through the work for the goodness, quote, these cruel spears turn into shafts of light, radiating along which my spirit travels, building its final next, the spiritual universe. Suffering wrapped up in doing good work can be transformed into a non-theistic and natural spirituality for Adler. Now, at times, I discount some of this talk because it feels like it's glorifying martyrdom. I felt similarly about Bonhoeffer's phrase that he wanted a, quote, fine, devout death. Bonhoeffer admitted that he was afraid of death, but he added that he was ashamed of these natural feelings. As Renate Wind wrote, he was ready to die. It was only his animal nature that again and again made him contemptible in his own eyes, that led him away from himself. His true self, the self that he embraced, wanted to follow Christ's example. Not something that I encourage people. I don't want people to get crucified. But Bonhoeffer wrote that plenty of people pretend to follow Christ, to seek what he called cheap grace, a grace that's just about going through the motions. Bonhoeffer yearned for a costly grace, he called it, that comes only through profound sacrifice. He writes, it is costly because it costs a man his life, and it is grace because it gives a man the only true life. It is costly because it condemns sin, and grace because it justifies the sinner. Above all, it is costly because it costs God the life of his Son. Like Adler, Bonhoeffer saw suffering as a necessary part of working in the world, of easing the suffering of others. I have to distance myself from the extremes of that. But I do understand that suffering with those who are suffering is part of life. This is why Bonhoeffer told his mentor, Reinhold Niebuhr, in 1939 that he couldn't stay in New York, that he had to go back to Germany because he believed that he had to live through the crisis of his nation along with the other people in Germany. He says, I have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I do not share in the trials of this time with my people. He could not do the work he was called to do, he concluded, quote, from a place of security. It's a reminder that we need to get into the world, right? This overlaps with both Adler's and Bonhoeffer's sense of duty to help the suffering and the oppressed. They both admitted they lived a relatively privileged life. They could have closed their eyes and been relatively comfortable. But like Adler, who was raised to respond to fellow beings struggling in the water, Bonhoeffer chose saving others over personal salvation. He wrote, "With swarms of unemployed before our eyes, millions of children suffering throughout the world, the starving in China, the oppressed in India, and in our own unhappy countries, who, thinking all of this, would wish unconcernedly and uncaringly to enter the promised land?" Bonhoeffer's concern for the oppressed people was sharpened by his experience at the Abyssinian Baptist Church in New York City. A black classmate at Manhattan's Union Theological took him to this dynamic community led by the pastor Adam Clayton Powell. Bonhoeffer borrowed many of Powell's ideas and phrases in developing his theology. He was particularly impressed with the piety and the emotionalism of this community of severely oppressed people for centuries. Bonhoeffer attended their services, he worked with their youth groups, he had meals in their homes. The religious passion that he witnessed contrasted sharply with the seminary's intellectualism. An example of this intellectualism is how the seminary and the official church interpreted the Sermon on the Mount, one of the most demanding parts of the Bible, right? It tells us to love our enemies, pray for those who persecute us, and care for the poor. It challenges us, and it challenges the wealth and the power of the institutional church, which is why church leaders reinterpreted the Sermon on the Mount to say it's not really about doing all those things, because nobody could do that. It taught that it's just a reminder of how far we are from Jesus. It's just a reminder that we're sinners. But Bonhoeffer taught that the Sermon on the Mount actually asks more of us. It asks us to live like Jesus, to follow his example. According to his biographer, Bonhoeffer says we must try to live according to the Sermon on the Mount without compromise. His best-known book, The Cost of Discipleship, emphasizes this theme and promotes seeking costly grace. He taught, "We have for once learned to see the great events of world history from below, from the perspective of the outcasts, the suspects, the maltreated. In short, from the perspective of those who suffer. Mere waiting and looking on is not Christian behavior. Christians are called to compassion and action." Something I'll talk more about in a minute. Bonhoeffer and Adler also shared the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason. Dietrich praised the revolutionary contribution that reason made. In Ethics, he explains, "Emancipated reason rose to unsuspected heights. The free exercise of reason created an atmosphere of truthfulness, light, and clarity. Prejudice, social conceits, hollow forms, and insensitive sentimentality were swept clean by the fresh wind of intellectual clarity. Intellectual honesty in all things, including questions of belief, was the great achievement of emancipated reason, and it has ever since been one of the indispensable moral requirements of Western man." End quote. Faith and reason can live together. Despite the creeping and dark irrationality of the world and Germany, Bonhoeffer rejected Sigmund Freud's emphasis on evil. Bonhoeffer's father, Karl, who was a psychotherapist, basically opposed Freud's theory. Karl saw this emphasis on dark internal forces of the psyche as too self-referential, too self-absorbed. This was very much the perspective of Felix Adler as well. Both he and Karl, while admitting we had a dark side, emphasized the light of inspiration. Bonhoeffer inherited this aversion to focusing on the unconscious dark forces He found it too sinister. He wanted to know reality and cope with it rationally. Rather than diving into our dark unconscious, we needed, quote, sober self-control. Again, something that Adler believed. Now, where he differed from Adler was that he feared that reason could distract you from God. Bonhoeffer said that being, quote, wise can lead you to forget divine truth. He writes, the simple man knows God and the commandments no longer oppress him. He believed that commandments like love your neighbor offer liberation. Their ethical truth helps us choose righteousness over comfort. Sometimes he thought that the wise folks are so rational that they avoid those truths. Now, while I can't accept a lot of Bonhoeffer's theistic paradigms, it does lead him to a fascinating and unique theory of eerily contemporary significance. It was called the theory of stupidity. Now, before I continue, I want to be clear that I don't support the use of the term stupidity or stupid today. It's too close to the playground taunts that kids throw at each other that we're now seeing in politics. We have to defend the truth. We have to resist what this theory lays out. But I'd choose a different term, perhaps willful ignorance. Okay? But today I'm going to use Bonhoeffer's vocabulary because I'm quoting from him. He distinguishes stupidity from ignorance. He says that ignorance is not knowing the truth. Stupidity is refusing to accept it. Bonhoeffer explains that even when presented with the facts that contradict their beliefs, a stupid person will dismiss the facts as irrelevant. Months before stupidity led him to be executed, Bonhoeffer wrote, stupidity is a more dangerous enemy of the good than malice. One may protest against evil. It can be exposed and it need be prevented by use of force. Evil always carries with it the germ of its own subversion in that it leaves behind, in human beings at least, a sense of unease. Against stupidity, we are defenseless. Neither protest nor the use of force accomplish anything here. Reason falls on deaf ears. Facts that contradict one's prejudgment simply need not be believed. In such moments, the stupid person even becomes critical. And when facts are irrefutable, they are just pushed aside as inconsequential, as incidental. In all this, the stupid person, in contrast to the malicious one, is utterly self-satisfied and, being easily irritated, becomes dangerous by going on the attack. For that reason, greater caution is called when dealing with a stupid person than with a malicious one. Never again will we try to persuade the stupid person with reasons, for it is senseless and dangerous. And this brings me to deed before creed, Adler and Bonhoeffer's emphasis on action. In The Cost of Discipleship, Bonhoeffer writes that relying on Christ's forgiveness is cheap grace. In one letter from prison titled Stations on the Road to Freedom, he explains how our salvation depends on action. Quote, daring to do what's right, not what fancy may tell you, valiantly grasping occasions, not cravenly doubting. Freedom comes only through deeds, not through thoughts taking wing. Faint not nor fear, but go out to the storm and the action, trusting in God whose commandment you faithfully follow. Freedom, exultant, will welcome you, your spirit, with joy. So acting in the world is more important than ideology. If when witnessing the world, we start to intellectualize, we can get distracted. We may analyze the suffering, but we won't alleviate it. Bonhoeffer emphasizes in ethics that hearing must instantly become doing. This is particularly true when evil is all around us. Those who gather to resist meet that challenge. Heinz Todd, who wrote Authentic Faith, Bonhoeffer's Theological Ethics and Context, put it this way: man is freed for action, and in such freedom the group can be united for undertaking responsible deeds on behalf of others. Now, in the months before his execution, Bonhoeffer echoed this idea through the concept of religionless Christianity, something that Bonhoeffer borrowed from Abyssinian Baptist Church, actually, that became popular among liberal theologians. Religionless Christianity obviously reminded me of ethical culture. Bonhoeffer believed that history had brought us to a world come of age, a world where humanity had matured and became self-reliant. We no longer need in that world a strong God to protect us. It's time for what Bonhoeffer called a weak God, a God that suffers alongside the destitute and the oppressed. This God calls on us all to do the same. Bonhoeffer suggests that we don't need an institutional church to support or guide us. He maintained that a mature world full of people may pray as individuals, but we don't need the buildings and the social structure of contemporary religion. There might be private religion, but it would do good works, not build institutions. Religionless Christianity directs our attention away from academic debates about whether Christ and God are one or three, towards the role of Christ as a person, how he lived his life. And in this way, Bonhoeffer advocates for a more humanistic Christianity. And it brings me to the final section of my talk about one other similarity between Bonhoeffer and Adler, and that's their willingness to challenge those in power. The form of challenge differed primarily due to their circumstances. I mean, Adler lived in a world where reform was possible, where darkness could be filled with light. Bonhoeffer lived in a darker world. Adler could appeal, lobby, fundraise, and build for good causes, but Bonhoeffer had to confront evil more directly. As early as 1933, when he was only 26 years old, and the Nazi machine was beginning to rain its terror down on Germany, he urged the church to stop the machine. Not simply to, quote, bandage the victims under the wheel, but jam a spoke in the wheel itself to stop the machine. That was the theme of a speech that was broadcast on radio titled, "The Younger Generation Changed View of the Concept of Führer." He explained how the simmering public anger over Germany's defeat in World War I became fuel for demagogues, particularly the Führer, which means leader. And that's important in this quote. Bonhoeffer said, "Should the leader allow himself to succumb to the wishes of those he leads, who will always seek to turn him into an idol, then the image of the leader will become the image of the misleader. This is the leader who makes an idol of himself and his office, and thus mocks God." The radio broadcast was cut off before Bonhoeffer could finish. To honor God for Bonhoeffer, he became a courier for the resistance. He mainly distributed intelligence from the British to the German resistance, but he also supported plots to kill Hitler. Though he was a pacifist, he felt that sometimes you have to do evil in order to avoid becoming evil. Maybe that's what he meant when he wrote these words: "The man of duty will end by having to fulfill his obligation, even to the devil." In a document titled 10 Years After, that he wrote in prison, Bonhoeffer explained, quote, "We recognize that historical circumstances sometimes call for extreme remedies. So he risked sinning through extreme action because he believed God, quote, promises forgiveness and consolation to the man who becomes a sinner in that venture. Now, it sort of sounds to me like a question of means and ends. Can we violate some of our ethical principles for a greater good? Bonhoeffer thought that it was, and he was willing to sin and to suffer for the sake of others. Religion for Bonhoeffer was not an escape from the world. It pushed him into the muddiness of a complicated world where one tries to change the real to the ideal. He hoped, quote, that we do not let things come and go as they are. That our faith really is not opium which leaves us content in the midst of an unjust world. Take what you will from this talk. I'm going to say what I took from it. I'm not as courageous as this Lutheran minister. I'm never going to sacrifice as he did. But I hope his stories help me, even in retirement, not settle for the opium of comfort. In the middle of an unjust world, I hope it inspires me to be a little more deliberate and overt in resisting injustice. I hope it encourages the same in you. Because maybe if enough of us do this, no one will have to pay, as did Bonhoeffer with his life. Maybe collectively we can stick a spoke in the wheel of injustice while giving love and comfort to those who are suffering, as did the minister I honor today. Payne Best, who was a friend that Bonhoeffer made in prison, reflected how Dietrich seemed at peace with his decision to die for his cause. Payne wrote, Bonhoeffer was all humanity and sweetness. He always seemed to diffuse an atmosphere of happiness or joy in even the smallest event in life, and of deep gratitude for the mere fact that he was alive. May we all nurture such joy and commitment against injustice in our lives and in the world. Thanks for listening.